The global economy has seen some of its strongest moments when countries have kept politics out of their economic relations. That was especially true in the post-Cold War years, but no longer.
Over the course of the last 10 or 15 years, geopolitical tensions have risen. Tensions that call into question the underlying economic ties among countries. And as those geopolitical tensions rose, the willingness and ability of governments to use economic policies to try to reinforce their geopolitical policies also rose. So much so that in the academic world, there is now a new interest in what is being called geoeconomics. I'm Jeff Frieden. I'm a professor of international and public affairs and political science at Columbia University.
Frieden has studied the historical use of economic coercion in geopolitics and says there are some lessons to be learned, especially in that period between the two world wars.
You had trade wars and currency wars and eventually shooting wars. That lesson may be relevant in thinking about what's happening today. Once economic relations and geopolitical relations get tightly connected, there's always that danger.
Frieden's article, The Cost of Geoeconomic Coercion, appears in the June issue of Finance and Development magazine. Journalist Rhoda Metcalf caught up with him to discuss this increasingly political approach to trade.
So this may seem like an obvious question, but why is it so appealing for governments to use economic tools for political purposes?
Well, because it, in many ways, seems like a better way of trying to achieve geopolitical goals than going to war or threatening war.
Sure.
So at some level, we might say this is a better way of achieving political and geopolitical goals because it doesn't put lives in danger, at least not on the battlefield. So it's attractive, it's appealing. Countries have always used whatever tools they have in their toolkit to try to achieve their goals. And that includes using economic policies for non-economic purposes. But after the Cold War ended, starting in the early 1990s, most countries, most of the time, separated their economic policies from their geopolitical and more broadly foreign policies. And we got used to that.
Right.
It seemed like we had a separation between trade policies, financial policies, the role of the dollar on the one hand, and whatever geopolitical tensions there might be on the other.
Sure.
That, in some sense, was something of an anomaly. During the Cold War, both the West and the East used their economies as weapons in the Cold War. We had, in the West, in the United States and its allies, we had a very, very tight control over any economic relations with the Soviet Union and its allies in Eastern Europe. But when the Cold War ended, to some extent, we moved into a new environment of globalization, what some might call hyperglobalization, where economic ties among countries became central. So many of us forgot about the possibility of using these economic policies for non-economic purposes.
Right.
But geopolitical tensions have been rising pretty substantially over the past 10 or 15 years. And so if a country like the United States or any other rich, relatively powerful country is in a conflict with another nation, it's attractive to a policymaker to say, well, we trade a lot with them, we have a lot of investments, we have a lot of financial ties with them. Let's use those economic ties to try to enforce our will, to try to exercise our power. From the standpoint of a policymaker, using the economic power that a country has is appealing.
But you argue in your recent F&D article that this is not a cost-free strategy.
Absolutely. There is a little bit of an illusion in the use of these economic policies for geopolitical purposes, because the policymaker typically focuses on what they're going to gain, the benefits. And often that leads them to ignore some of the even long-term or even short-term costs of those policies.
So what can the cost be?
They vary a lot by the policy that's used, but let's take the example of sanctions or export controls.
Right.
Those are two very common forms of geoeconomic policies. Sanctions means typically that we won't buy anything from the country or we won't sell anything to the country. Well, what that's doing by saying we can't buy from them or can't sell to them is restricting the economic opportunities to our firms, to our economy. Right? If we can't sell to a large foreign market, for example, Russia is a large market. We can't sell to the Russian market. Our firms are foregoing profit opportunities. They're foregoing opportunities that could create jobs, that could create other opportunities in other parts of the economy. If we're not buying from another country, we are again, presumably, restricting our access to lower cost products from other lands.
Yes.
To put it in economic terms, what you do when you restrict economic activity for political purposes is you move the country away from its comparative advantage. It's presumably, in an open economy, it's doing thing that's most efficient to do,
right.
and it's buying from people who are doing things efficiently, right? They're producing goods that are attractive to our consumers and to our firms. We're producing goods that are efficiently produced and are attractive to them. If that's not permitted, you're basically moving the economy away from the most efficient use of its resources, and that's a cost.
Right. Even the fact that you are losing some of this potential market can have blowback in the country itself, right?
Right. So to take an example, there was a period, and this goes back to the Cold War, where Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, had a series of bad harvests, and American farmers were really eager to sell to the Soviet Union, and were prohibited from doing so by COCOM, by the agreement at the time. And eventually they lobbied the U.S. government and got permission to sell what eventually turned out to be very, very large quantities of wheat and other farm products to the Soviet Union. It was extremely profitable. It was very good for a lot of American farmers. It was an efficient use of American resources. And so, in a sense, the Russians benefited, the Soviets benefited because they got this cheaper food, and American farmers benefited. Now, we would not at that time have sold the Soviet Union missile technology or anything that could have been used for any military purpose. Right. But a decision was made that the cost of restricting our farmers' access to the Soviet market was greater than any benefit that we would have achieved by restricting it. And that's the kind of calculation that I think policymakers have to make. What are we foregoing? What are we giving up? What is the cost to us, to our firms, to our farmers, to our workers by restricting access to another market?
I would also imagine that sometimes when governments choose to put in some kind of a sanction that affects certain sectors of the economy, the people that are involved in that sector might also turn against the leadership of the government. So you can have sort of an internal political blowback.
Almost all economic policies have winners and losers.
Right.
And restricting a firm's access to a foreign market makes them a loser. You don't really want your geopolitical policies to lead to political unrest, social conflict, to cause damage to your constituents, to damage to your people that can lead them to be hostile to the policies you're trying to pursue. So it can be counterproductive in that sense.
And sort of oddly, you point out that there can be upsides for the countries that find themselves under economic sanctions sometimes over time.
Right. This is one of the ironies of imposing sanctions. There is now a fair amount of evidence that when sanctions are imposed on a country, it stimulates them to carry out a lot of innovative activity, to set their research and development teams on the path to figuring out ways around the sanctions, not necessarily to evade the sanctions, but to produce the goods that they can't get internationally at home.
Absolutely.
There are famous stories from World War II where the Germans, apparently, who were embargoed, blockaded during the war, found substitutes and invented substitutes, came up with artificial rubber, came up with methadone as a substitute for opium, for morphine to use for wounded soldiers. And we know, because we've seen it over the past 10, 12 years, that when Russia was sanctioned after the 2014 invasion of Ukraine, it went on a very rapid path towards innovating in a lot of activities that we're now ruled out by the sanctions. Now, I'm not saying that that was necessarily the best use of their resources. They might have been better off buying the technology from us, but it did stimulate innovative activity.
Right.
So, that's a risk. The risk is that these sanctions could be counterproductive if what we're doing is stimulating innovative activity in countries that we would rather not do that.
How do international institutions fit into this? I mean, are there regulatory bodies that can hold countries back from overusing sanctions and tariffs?
Well, people talk a lot about the rules-based international economic order, which I think it's very important that there are rules. There's sort of guideposts or guidelines that define what is acceptable behavior.
Right.
But there is no world government. So what does it mean to have rules if there's no one there to enforce them? Really what we have in the international arena, economically and politically, is expectations of behavior. We expect countries to behave in a particular way. And what the institutions that you're talking about, whether it's the World Trade Organization or the World Bank or the IMF or the Bank for International Settlements, what these institutions do is provide a way of monitoring what other countries are doing. They create a sort of a sense that we're all in this, we are all members of this organization. There's a set of norms that we're going to abide by. So they contribute to the notion that there are expected patterns of behavior, really.
Right.
But if a country decides that it's not going to abide by those norms, there's not much that the world can do about it.
Yeah, there's no trade police that they can send out.
No. Well, I mean, listen, the WTO does have enforcement powers in some way, but if the U.S. or the European Union or China decide to ignore the WTO or the IMF or the World Bank, well, that's going to stand. There's not much you can do about that. I would say that really one of the things that can be a break on them from the standpoint of the country that's thinking about using these measures is the cost to the country in its own credibility and reputation.
Right.
Reputation is valuable in international economic affairs as it is in everything else. A reputation for abiding by your treaties, a reputation for following through on your agreements, a reputation for treating foreigners fairly if they're in your market. Those reputations are valuable.
In terms of investment.
In terms of everything, there's a lot of trust that goes into a trading relationship.
Right.
If I'm investing in another country, I have to trust that that government isn't going to come in and take over my plant or
Change the rules.
change the rules, impose unfair regulations on it. If I'm a bank or a bondholder lending money to another government, I want some assurance that my loans are going to be treated fairly. And so, there's the old lines about it takes 50 years to build up a reputation and 15 minutes to destroy it. Countries' reputations are valuable. There are many, many countries around the world that can't borrow at any interest rate, and that's because investors don't trust their governments. You don't want to be in that category.
You've also looked at this phenomenon historically. Can you give us a sense of how this coercive use of economics has evolved, over the centuries?
We can go back to the beginning of the modern world economy. The modern world economy really starts as the Europeans go out from Europe, in 1492 and that era. That's the first point at which there really is a truly world economy. And the organization of that world economy was very much an integration of geopolitics and economics. It was a system called mercantilism, and the most famous phrase that describes mercantilist theory is usually attributed to Thomas Hobbes, who said, "Wealth is power and power is wealth." The idea was we're going to put together an empire and we're going to earn from that empire, and the wealth that we accrue from that empire we're going to use to build up our army and our navy, and then our army and our navy are going to protect the empire and going to make it easy for us to extract more resources. And so military power was used to extract wealth, and the wealth was used to reinforce military power. And that was the way the great powers of the day, France, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, ruled the world really from the 1500s until the 1900s.
So all the wealthiest countries also had big, strong armies.
That's right. But in the early 19th century, with the Industrial Revolution, things began to change. And starting in Great Britain, the home of the Industrial Revolution, the idea was we are going to try to separate our economic ties with the rest of the world from our geopolitical interests. Now, they didn't do it perfectly, but that was really the first era of globalization, starting in the 1830s, 1840s, all the way up to World War I. An era of globalization in which most countries, most of the time, certainly the European powers, focused on economic relations. There were a few relatively minor wars, but no world wars, of course, and that relative reduction in geopolitical tension went hand in hand with a huge increase in international economic integration. Then you have World Wars I and II, and that whole period, again, there may be some lessons there for what to avoid, but what we saw is over the course of the first part of the 20th century, there was increasing competition between Great Britain and Germany, between Germany and Russia, Austria-Hungary and Russia, and that competition eventually led to World War I. In the interwar period, international economics and geopolitics were tightly intertwined. You had trade wars and currency wars and eventually shooting wars. So that whole period from 1914 until the 1940s was one in which geopolitics and international economics were, again, very tightly intertwined. And maybe there's a little bit of a lesson there that when that happens, the chances that the troubled economic relations among countries fade into ever more troubled geopolitical relations among countries, that lesson may be relevant in thinking about what's happening today. I don't think any of us want to go back to that interwar period in which trade wars eventually lead to shooting wars. But once economic relations and geopolitical relations get tightly connected, there's always that danger. Right. So that's another cost, I suppose, of using economic policies for geopolitical purposes, is that it can inflame both.
So ultimately, if you were the advisor in the room, what would you suggest governments do before they go down this track? And are there alternatives to it?
I think that negotiation is pretty much always possible. That the threat of economic sanctions should be enough, in some sense, to try to convince governments to cooperate. So I tend to think that when relations between countries break down, it's a failure of the countries in question. It's a failure of a possibility for compromise. There is always room for compromise. It may be that neither country, neither government comes away fully satisfied. That's the meaning of compromise, after all. But as with war, there's always a better alternative. Although I can understand why governments find it appealing to use these economic policies for geopolitical purposes, they have costs. Sometimes those costs are significant. Sometimes those costs fall on members of society who didn't ask for it and are vulnerable. Sometimes those costs are not worth the benefit that they bring in geopolitical terms. And since there is always the possibility that the use of these tools will fail, I think that a responsible policymaker should attempt everything short of using them first. Now, threatening them is, in some sense, I suppose, if you threaten, every once in a while you have to use them. Right. But the threat of cutting trade off with another country or impinging on another country's economic activities is a weapon that should be used cautiously, should be used only in extremis, and I think whose use should be seen as a failure of diplomacy, not a success.
Such an interesting and timely conversation. Jeffry Frieden, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
My pleasure, Rhoda. Always good to talk to you.
Jeffry Frieden is a professor of international and public affairs and political science at Columbia University. He's also a professor of government emeritus at Harvard. He was speaking with Rhoda Metcalf. Look for Jeff Frieden's article on the cost of geoeconomic coercion in the June issue of Finance and Development magazine. Go to imf.org/F&D. And look for other IMF podcasts on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen. You can also follow us on X. Our handle is @IMF_podcast. I'm Bruce Edwards.
And I'm Rhoda Metcalf. Thanks for listening.